The day began like any other, a sunny afternoon in the heart of Compton, California. The grocery store buzzed with the ordinary hum of life, carts squeaking down aisles, quiet conversations between neighbors, and the soft clinking of glass bottles being shelved. Among the shoppers, some browsed leisurely, while others moved with purpose, ticking off items from their mental checklists. It was a scene of everyday life, a backdrop that held no hint of the storm brewing on the horizon. Among the crowd, Snoop Dogg, Compton's own, dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, moved effortlessly through the store. Despite his fame, he had a way of blending into his surroundings, his laid-back demeanor making him seem like just another shopper. With one hand gripping a basket and the other typing on his phone, Snoop moved toward the produce section, his gaze scanning the oranges. Nearby stood Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 70s, adjusting her glasses as she inspected a bag of apples. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and her cardigan bore the faded elegance of decades past. She exuded an air of impatience, her lips moving as she muttered to herself. She seemed unremarkable, the kind of figure who could easily fade into the background, until she spoke. Snoop reached for a bag of oranges, his focus still on his phone. But as he stepped closer, Mrs. Thompson stiffened. Her gaze shifted sharply to him, her expression darkening. The transformation was immediate and unmissable. Her narrowed eyes and tightened lips betrayed a simmering disdain, and when she spoke, her words sliced through the hum of the store like a whip. "You people don't belong here," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. The moment froze. Snoop's fingers hovered over his phone, his eyes lifting to meet hers. For a split second, disbelief flickered across his face, but Mrs. Thompson was far from done. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" she continued, her tone sharp and unapologetic. The store's rhythm ground to a halt. Shoppers exchanged uneasy glances, the air thick with discomfort. Some stopped in their tracks, pretending to browse while straining to hear. The cheerful chatter of moments ago had been replaced by an oppressive silence. Snoop's initial reaction was one of shock. He blinked, his brow furrowing as her words sank in. He opened his mouth as if to respond immediately, but stopped himself. Instead, he took a slow, measured breath. His face betrayed nothing, a mask of calm as he processed the situation. Mrs. Thompson, meanwhile, stood her ground, her expression resolute. She clutched her apples tightly, her posture rigid with defiance. Around them, the tension was palpable. A young mother hurried her child away, while an elderly man near the potatoes adjusted his cap nervously, watching the scene unfold. For what felt like an eternity, Snoop remained still, gripping the handle of his basket. The world seemed to shrink around him, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, a sharp contrast to the hostility in Mrs. Thompson's tone. "Ma'am," he began, his words steady and clear, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't accusatory, it was reflective, almost gentle, as if offering her a chance to reconsider. But Mrs. Thompson was unyielding. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A young woman near the bread aisle clasped her hands over her mouth, while a cashier craned her neck to get a better view. The tension in the room was unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity. Snoop stood firm, his composure unshaken. He let the silence hang, giving her words the weight they deserved, and allowing everyone present to absorb them. Then, slowly, he set his basket down and straightened his posture. "All right," he said, nodding slightly. "Let's talk about that." His calmness was disarming, his voice carrying a quiet strength that drew everyone closer. Even those pretending not to listen found themselves unable to look away. "You said I don't belong here," he continued, his tone measured but firm. "But let me tell you a little something about where I come from." The crowd leaned in, the weight of his words pulling them like gravity. "My great-great-grandfather," Snoop began, his voice steady, "was born right here in California. But before that, my family was brought here against their will. They were enslaved, forced to build this state, this country, with their blood, sweat, and tears. Mrs. Thompson's expression faltered, her lips tightening. Around her, the crowd hung on Snoop's every word. My grandfather, he continued, his voice growing stronger, fought in the Korean War. He risked his life for a country that didn't even recognize him as an equal when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him. The store was silent now, even the hum of the refrigerator seeming to fade. And my parents, Snoop said, his tone softening but losing none of its power. They fought too. Not with guns or fists, but by raising me to respect everyone, no matter what they look like. My mother dedicated her life to teaching kids about love and equality. My father, he's the kind of man who'd stop to help someone like you if your car broke down. Snoop's eyes locked onto Mrs. Thompson's, his gaze unwavering. So, you tell me I don't belong here? He asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in ways you'll never understand. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, her words caught in her throat. Snoop stepped back, his voice now addressing the entire store. I could have walked away, he said, his tone steady. But ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Slowly, the tension began to dissolve. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his voice breaking the quiet. He's right, the man said, his tone resolute. We've got to be better. The crowd murmured in agreement, the spell broken. A young cashier called out, her voice trembling with emotion. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully, she said. Thank you. Mrs. Thompson glanced around, her defiance crumbling under the weight of the crowd's silent judgment. She turned away, her movement stiff as she pushed her cart down the aisle. Snoop picked up his basket, his expression calm but resolute. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered. And as the store slowly returned to its rhythm, one thing was clear. This was more than a confrontation. It was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that even in the ordinary, extraordinary change is possible. The grocery store had resumed its usual buzz, but the air was still heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Mrs. Thompson stood by her cart, gripping it tightly. Her face, once firm with defiance, was now shadowed by confusion. Her lips trembled as if searching for the right words, but none came. The fight in her demeanor seemed to have vanished, replaced by uncertainty. Snoop, watching her carefully, let his expression soften. It wasn't pity, but understanding. He took a step closer, his voice calm yet firm. It's not just about the words you said, he began, his tone steady. It's about how they reflect something deeper, something that hurts not just me, but the people who come after me. Words shape how we see each other. Actions, though, are what truly matter. Mrs. Thompson's hand twitched, gripping the edge of her cart. Her voice, now quieter, barely audible, broke the silence. I didn't mean it like that. But even she seemed uncertain of her own defense, and the sentence trailed off. A slow clap broke the tension. It came from the deli counter, where James, the butcher, stood. It was hesitant at first, but soon caught on. Shoppers, one by one, joined in. The sound filled the store, growing louder, echoing the sentiment of unity against division. Mrs. Thompson glanced around nervously, her face pale as she pushed her cart toward the exit. Her retreat was slow, almost reluctant, but she said nothing more. As the door closed behind her, a woman from the crowd, Tanya, stepped toward Snoop and placed a hand on his shoulder. Thank you, she said softly, for saying what many of us feel but are too afraid to voice. Snoop nodded, his expression reflective. Picking up his basket, he murmured, Sometimes it's not about proving a point. It's about making the truth impossible to ignore. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations softer, more thoughtful. Some smiled at Snoop as they passed, their faces reflecting gratitude or newfound understanding. Later that evening, Snoop sat with a few of his friends in his living room, the hum of quiet chatter filling the space. Leroy, an old friend, leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "You handled that better than most people would, Snoop. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for everyone watching." Snoop sipped his drink, nodding thoughtfully. "Sometimes, people lash out because they've never been challenged to see things differently. Maybe she won't change, but someone else might have seen the truth in what I said." "You planted a seed," Leroy agreed. "That's all anyone can do. Plant it and hope it grows." Across town, in her small, dimly lit kitchen, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table, her hands clasped tightly together. Her untouched dinner sat before her, the steam long since gone cold. Snoop's words echoed in her mind. "My family paid the price for this country in blood, sweat, and tears." The image of his calm, unwavering expression wouldn't leave her. She thought of her own grandchildren, their faces innocent and hopeful. What kind of world was she leaving for them? Her eyes fell on the framed photo of her late husband on the counter. He had always been kinder, more open-minded. Her chest tightened with regret. For the first time, she wondered if her beliefs, the ones she'd held so tightly, were truly her own, or just remnants of another time. The story of what had happened at the grocery store spread quickly. Neighbors recounted Snoop's composure and the quiet power of his words. It became a topic of conversation in homes, at barbershops, and in schools. For Snoop, the attention was unwelcome but inevitable. Strangers approached him with words of gratitude. Some shared their own experiences, while others simply nodded in silent acknowledgement. "It's not about being a hero," Snoop said one evening during an impromptu neighborhood gathering. "It's about making sure ignorance doesn't go unchecked. Change starts with conversations, uncomfortable ones, but they're necessary." The crowd around him murmured in agreement. Young people, inspired by his words, promised to carry the message forward in their own way. Weeks later, Mrs. Thompson walked into the same grocery store, her steps slower, her demeanor less rigid. She paused by the produce section, the memory of that day flooding back. Picking up a bag of apples, she noticed a young man stacking bananas nearby. He glanced up and smiled at her, a simple gesture, but one that made her pause. She smiled back. It was a start. Sometimes, change doesn't come in a sweeping gesture. It comes in small, quiet moments, in seeds planted by words and actions that ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully see. This story reminds us all, standing up for what's right doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it's about speaking with conviction, letting your actions echo louder than any insult. If this story resonated with you, let it inspire you to choose kindness and understanding. The world doesn't change in a day, but it changes with each step we take toward compassion. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment. It reflects the importance of equality and understanding. Resemblance to real events or people is purely coincidental.